You've watched a country with almost nothing in its vaults outnegotiate a country with vaults full of gold, and some part of you has clocked that this shouldn't be possible. Gold is supposed to be the thing. It's the resource every empire in the popular imagination hoards, buries, wars over. But look at the actual balance sheet of power across the last 5 centuries and the pattern breaks. Spain took more silver out of the Americas than any state before it had ever extracted from anywhere, and Spain still went bankrupt 7 separate times. The Dutch Republic, sitting on herring, peat, and cheese, built the first financial system sophisticated enough to fund the wars of everyone else in Europe, including Spain's. Somewhere in that contradiction is the actual logic of material power, and it isn't the logic you were taught. Here's the pattern you've probably already half noticed without a name for it. The countries that win, structurally and durably, are rarely the ones sitting on the shiniest resource. They're sitting on the boring one: coal, oil, phosphate, wheat, refining capacity, the input that everyone else's economy or army cannot function without. Call it what the field calls it. Michael Clare, in Resource Wars, 2001, made the case that the 21st century's conflicts would increasingly track not ideology but access to specific material inputs: energy, water, minerals, the unglamorous stuff that keeps a modern state's machinery running. Daniel Yergin's The Prize, 1991, which won the Pulitzer for exactly this argument, traced how oil, not gold, became the organizing resource of the 20th century, the thing that moved armies, built navies, and decided who could project power and who could only watch. The real axis of resource power is not what you've been told it is. You were taught that gold is wealth and wealth is power. What history actually shows is that fungibility, the thing that makes gold universally exchangeable, is precisely what makes it strategically inert. Gold sits. It doesn't feed an army, fuel a tank, or fertilize a wheat field. The resources that decide wars and outlast empires are the ones that are inputs, not stores. You can't eat gold. You can't refine gold into diesel. And a state that has cornered the diesel or the phosphate or the chip fabrication has leverage that a vault of bullion simply cannot replicate. Go back to 1942. You're watching German logistics maps from that summer, and the offensive doesn't point toward Moscow. Points south toward the Caucasus, toward Baku. Case Blue was not a strategy of conquest for its own sake. It was an oil strategy, because Germany's mechanized war machine was running out of the one input that made mechanization possible in the first place. Adam Tooze, in The Wages of Destruction, 2006, lays out how thoroughly Germany's war economy was constrained by resource shortfall from the very beginning. Synthetic fuel production could never scale to match consumption, and the entire Eastern campaign carried, underneath the ideology, a resource acquisition logic that doomed it the moment it stalled. Ploiești, a Romanian oil town most people couldn't place on a map, absorbed more Allied bombing runs than most capital cities, because roughly a third of Axis oil ran through it. That's not a footnote. That's the entire war's fuel gauge sitting in one province. You feel the same logic land, 6,000 miles east, a few months later. Japan's imperial expansion into Southeast Asia in 1941 wasn't chasing gold either. It was chasing rubber and, above all, oil after the American embargo cut roughly 80% of the oil Japan needed to keep its navy and industry moving. Pearl Harbor was not a gesture of ambition. It was a response to a resource chokehold, executed by a state that understood exactly what running out of one input would mean for everything else. This is the structural pattern you keep half recognizing in modern headlines. A state doesn't move for glory, it moves because a supply line to something unglamorous just got cut. But the more consequential piece is this. The logic didn't end with the 20th century's wars. It just changed its inputs. Sit with the 1973 OPEC embargo for a moment. No gold changed hands. No army crossed a border. A cartel of oil-producing states restricted supply, prices quadrupled, and Western economies that thought their power was settled spent the rest of the decade in stagflation they hadn't budgeted for. That structural power exercised without a single bullet, the kind of power Susan Strange described in States and Markets, 1988, where she argued explicitly that control over production, finance, security, and knowledge mattered more than any stockpile of wealth a state happened to be sitting on. Strange's framework explains something the gold-centric story never could: why a state with modest reserves and a monopoly on a critical input can outmaneuver a state with vaults full of static wealth and no leverage over anyone else's supply chain. Here is what that pattern actually produced in the world you're living in right now. China does not dominate global power through gold reserves. It dominates a choke point most people can't name: rare earth refining. China mines a majority of the world's rare earth ore, but the real leverage sits in refining capacity, where its share climbs closer to 90%. Rare earths, despite the name, aren't geologically scarce. The scarcity is manufactured. It's in who built the refining infrastructure and who didn't. That's not an accident of geology. That's 40 years of industrial policy aimed at exactly the kind of structural choke point Strange described, decades before most Western policymakers were paying attention to it. You can trace the same logic across a dozen other unglamorous inputs, and each one reads like a rerun of the oil story with the names changed. The Democratic Republic of Congo produces around 70% of the world's cobalt, the metal without which lithium-ion batteries, and therefore the entire electric vehicle transition, cannot scale. Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia hold most of the world's identified lithium in a region now called, without irony, the Lithium Triangle. None of these countries are gold powers in the classical sense. All of them now sit at the center of negotiations that used to be reserved for oil states. And here history has a precise name for what comes next when a state realizes its leverage runs through food rather than fuel. Morocco, together with the disputed territory of Western Sahara, holds an estimated 70% of the world's phosphate rock, the essential input for synthetic fertilizer, and therefore for the caloric output of half the planet's farmland. Belarus and Russia are major potash exporters, and when sanctions hit Belarusian potash in 2022, fertilizer supply chains strained on 3 continents within months. Ukraine and Russia together, before the 2022 invasion, supplied close to 30% of the world's wheat exports. That is not a resource you can stockpile in a vault. That is a resource that decides whether other countries' populations eat on schedule. A form of leverage gold has never once provided in any century. The deeper question, the one most coverage never reaches, is why resource wealth so often fails to convert into durable power at all, and here the story gets genuinely counterintuitive. The Netherlands discovered a massive natural gas field at Groningen in 1959, and the windfall was so large it actually damaged the rest of the Dutch economy. The currency appreciated, exports outside the gas sector became uncompetitive, manufacturing shrank. The economists coined the term Dutch disease in 1977 to describe exactly this pattern, and it turns out to apply almost everywhere resource wealth arrives suddenly and gets spent rather than structured. Spain in the 16th century ran the same script 300 years earlier without a name for it. Silver flowed in, and instead of funding domestic industry, it funded the purchase of manufactured goods from everyone else in Europe, hollowing out precisely the productive capacity that might have made Spanish power durable. Genoese bankers, and later Dutch ones, ended up financing Spain's own wars using Spain's own silver, capturing the value chain a resource-rich state assumed it controlled. Here's the mechanism underneath the mechanism, the part most coverage skips because it requires distinguishing a store of value from a productive input, and the distinction is not intuitive until someone names it for you. A store of value is inert. It sits, it appreciates or depreciates, and it can be exchanged for other things, but it does not itself do anything. A productive input is different in kind. It is consumed in the process of making something else, whether that something else is diesel fuel, fertilizer, a battery cell, or a microchip. Gold, historically, has been treated as the ultimate store. That is exactly why it has never been the resource that decided a war, a famine, or an industrial transition. The resources that decided those outcomes were always inputs, things that ran out, that needed refining, that had to move through a specific strait or a specific processing plant before they became useful to anyone. Go back further, before oil, before rare earths, and the same structural pattern is already running, just with a different commodity playing the role of choke point. In the 17th century, the Dutch East India Company fought a sustained military campaign over the Banda Islands, a scatter of volcanic outcrops in modern Indonesia that happened to be the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew. By 1621, the VOC had all but depopulated the islands to secure a monopoly on a spice that weighed almost nothing and shipped in barrels, not fleets. That's the same logic Ploiești would run 3 centuries later, compressed into a single crop instead of a fuel. Small in bulk, enormous in leverage, and worth a war precisely because it could not be substituted. You see the mirror image of that leverage in the states that got the geography wrong. Roughly a fifth of the world's daily oil consumption moves through the Strait of Hormuz, a channel narrow enough that a handful of coastal batteries could threaten to close it. That single choke point has shaped the naval posture of the United States in the Persian Gulf for 4 decades, not because anyone there is stockpiling gold, but because the strait itself is the resource, the ability to guarantee or threaten passage. Saudi Arabia's actual leverage over the 20th century oil market was never its reserves sitting in the ground. It was Aramco's spare production capacity, the ability to open or close the taps fast enough to move global prices within weeks. A state holding gold cannot do that to anyone. A state holding swing production capacity can do it to everyone. Here's what the same logic looks like when a resource-rich state gets the internal politics right instead of wrong. Norway found oil in the North Sea in the late 1960s and, unlike Spain with its silver or the Netherlands with its gas, built a legal architecture, the Government Pension Fund Global, that routed the windfall into long-term investment rather than domestic consumption. It's the closest thing to a controlled experiment the resource curse has ever gotten. Same category of discovery, opposite institutional response, and a markedly different structural outcome 3 generations later. The lesson isn't that resources doom a state. It's that what a state does with the input, refine it, store it, or spend it, decides whether the resource becomes leverage or liability. And you see the same input logic sitting quietly underneath a resource most coverage treats as a footnote to climate policy rather than a strategic asset. France has run one of the most nuclear-dependent electricity grids on Earth for half a century, and that grid has depended for decades on uranium supply chains running substantially through Niger. When that supply relationship came under strain in recent years, French energy planning treated it with the seriousness usually reserved for oil shocks because functionally, for a nuclear-heavy grid, that's exactly what a uranium disruption is. None of this shows up in a gold ledger. All of it shows up in a choke point map. The more consequential piece, again, is this: the United States spent decades as a net oil importer, structurally dependent on the same Gulf choke points everyone else was. Then, across roughly 2008 to 2014, hydraulic fracturing converted American shale formations from marginal deposits into the largest source of new oil and gas supply on the planet, and the United States flipped to a net exporter inside a single decade. That is a structural power shift on the scale of a war, achieved without a single gold reserve moving, entirely through control of an input, and it rearranged American strategic calculus in the Middle East for a generation. This is the reframe, and it is not reassurance, it is precision. What looks like disorder in resource geopolitics is actually a legible structural pattern, and the concept that makes it legible is resource determinism paired with strange structural power. Durable leverage comes from control over a production chain other states cannot substitute out of quickly, not from possession of a static store of value. Gold is portable and universally exchangeable, which is exactly why it confers so little strategic power. Anyone can get gold if they have something to trade for it. What they cannot easily get is refining capacity built over 40 years, or a fertilizer input concentrated in one contested territory, or a chip fabrication process only one island on Earth has fully mastered. Look at the modern case that fits this cleanest. Taiwan holds no resource wealth in the classical sense, no oil, no gold reserves that matter globally. What it holds is semiconductor fabrication capacity so advanced and so concentrated that policymakers now call it, informally, a silicon shield. That's not a metaphor stretched for effect. It's a direct 21st century descendant of the Ploiești logic, a small, specific location that happens to sit at the choke point of an input every advanced economy and every modern military now depends on. Widen the lens and the same shape keeps recurring, because the underlying mechanism is structural rather than accidental. Michael Clare's follow-up argument in The Race for What's Left, 2012, extended his earlier thesis. As the easily accessible deposits of a given input get exhausted, competition doesn't fade, it migrates toward harder, more contested frontiers. That's the logic behind Arctic seabed claims by states with no historical presence in the region, and behind deep-sea mining exploration licenses now being negotiated for polymetallic nodules on the ocean floor. None of those frontiers involve gold. All of them involve the next generation of the same inputs, cobalt, nickel, manganese, that already decided the battery supply chain contest onshore. John Mearsheimer's structural framework in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, 2001, offers the piece that ties the whole pattern together. Great powers behave the way they do not because of ideology or leadership personality, but because of the material constraints of an anarchic system, where no higher authority guarantees a state's security or its supply chains. Under that logic, a state's rational move is to minimize dependence on inputs it cannot itself control, which is precisely why choke point resources generate conflict at a rate gold reserves never have. Nobody goes to war over another country's vault. States go to war or come close to it over the pipeline, the strait, the refinery, and the mine that their own economy cannot function without. And the shift away from gold as the organizing symbol of power isn't just implicit in these cases. It happened formally on a specific date in full view. In 1971, the Nixon administration severed the dollar's convertibility to gold entirely. Contemporary observers half expected the system to buckle. Didn't. The dollar's power had already migrated to something else. Control over the world's dominant reserve currency, its clearing systems, its financial infrastructure, the exact kind of structural power strange would formalize 17 years later. Gold's demonetization wasn't a crisis. It was confirmation that the thing conferring power had already stopped being the metal. You are watching this pattern run in real time right now across every resource negotiation making headlines: lithium contracts in Bolivia, cobalt mining terms in the Congo, chip export controls aimed at Taiwan and China both, fertilizer diplomacy after 2022. None of these are gold stories. Every one of them is a choke point story, and once you have the concept, you can't unsee it in the next one. Barbara Tuchman's account in The Guns of August 1962 is usually read as a study of miscalculation and alliance structure in the run-up to the First World War. Read it again with inputs in mind and a second argument surfaces underneath the first. The great powers of 1914 were already organizing their industrial planning around coal, steel, and rail capacity, the boring inputs of that era's warfighting, long before the shooting started. The war's opening months were decided as much by whose rail network could move troops and material fastest as by whose generals were cleverest. Gold financed the war after it began. It did not decide who could fight it in the first place. That's the through line connecting Baku in 1942 to Hormuz in the 1980s to Taiwan's fabs today. In every case, the state under pressure was not short on wealth in the abstract. It was short on a specific, non-substitutable input, and no quantity of gold could be converted fast enough or directly enough into the thing actually needed. Fungibility, the exact property that makes gold universally desirable, is also the property that makes it strategically slow. It has to be converted into something else before it does anything, and in a genuine supply crunch, conversion takes time states in crisis do not have. Here is what the structural logic demands, without speculation dressed as certainty. States will keep competing over inputs, not stores. The next flashpoints will keep showing up in refining capacity, fertilizer chains, and fabrication nodes, not in bullion reserves, because bullion reserves were never where the leverage lived. The countries that understand this correctly are already restructuring around it. The ones still measuring power in vaults are measuring the wrong century. If this reframed how you're reading current events, the next video goes into a resource choke point almost no mainstream coverage has mapped correctly. The water infrastructure quietly deciding who controls the next generation of semiconductor manufacturing. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.